So this is the last week of classes. Next week is finals. The final exam has been posted online. It is the exact same format as the midterm, 4 short essay questions, open book, etc. Any questions about the final? Everyone's good? Okay. So we're going to cover the last chapter, which is foreign policy. There's 2 reasons I cover foreign policy. One, because most of you aren't going to take an international relations course. And 2, it's my favorite chapter, so you're stuck with it. So we're going to talk about some of the types of foreign policy and some of the actors that are part of U.S. foreign policy. So what exactly is foreign policy? Foreign policy is all of the policy that we use to interact with the rest of the world. So we're talking military, diplomacy, human rights, and economics. So basically, it's how we choose to interact with other countries. Do we have a good relationship or not? Do we threaten them with war, or do we increase trade? And so the biggest foreign policy makers are the President, Congress, and bureaucracies like the CIA, the State Department, and the Defense Department. And this is one area of policy where the president has more of an advantage constitutionally. Because they are commander-in-chief of the military and chief diplomat, they do have more power to set foreign policy. And with every other policy, there's going to be competition between interest groups, political parties, experts, and so on. All right, so one of the biggest areas of foreign policy is security. Throughout the 20th century, we were mostly concerned with foreign adversaries like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, actual nation states. In the 21st century, we now have to be more concerned with non-state actors. Basically, groups that are not established nations who are trying to shape foreign policy. 9/11 was carried out by a non-state actor, Al-Qaeda. Though they were based in Afghanistan, they were not a formal part of the government necessarily. ISIS is a non-state actor. It is not a recognized government. So terrorist groups tend to fall into non-state actors. So now we have to deal more with concerns about deadly terror attacks, hacking of computers, Things like someone driving a truck into a crowd or shooting a nightclub, things like that. And the attitude of the U.S. throughout most of our history was one of isolationism. Essentially, the U.S. basically said, we're not getting involved in other countries' problems. They've got to figure it out on their own. We did briefly enter World War I, and then we went back into isolationism. The attitude of the U.S. was, if we leave the rest of the world alone, they'll leave us alone. We're going to be fine. But of course, just because you ignore the world doesn't mean the world is going to ignore you. And so even though we had very little desire to get involved in World War II, when Japan attacked our military base at Pearl Harbor, we had no choice but to respond. So basically, it became clear that the U.S. couldn't sit on the sidelines and do nothing. So we were forced to join the war, and we became the major global actor in terms of security policy and military policy. So we went from, we're never getting involved to, well, we kind of have to get involved. Okay, so we get through World War II and we're allies with Russia during this time period. But then came the Cold War. And it was called the Cold War because we never directly went to war against the Soviet Union. And there were two types of policies that we used towards the Soviet Union. Part of it was called containment. We did try to keep the Soviet Union from spreading further throughout Europe. The division of Germany between West and East, the creation of the Berlin Wall, the policy of trying to prevent the spread of communism. But we did also sometimes use appeasement, trying to prevent war by giving in to their demands. The Cuban Missile Crisis is essentially a form of appeasement. We agreed to pull our missiles out of Turkey in response for them pulling their missiles out of Cuba. Both sides saved face, and we didn't go to war with each other. So essentially, we never went directly to war with the Soviet Union. But we did engage in several proxy wars with them. And the two biggest were the Korean and Vietnam Wars. North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union in its attempts to take over the Korean Peninsula and make it communist. So we were backing what is now South Korea in that war. And eventually it led to essentially a stalemate where we now have North Korea South Korea, and a border zone in between the countries that's full of weapons and personnel and so on. We also fought in Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism there, which didn't end up working. After we left North Vietnam, overran South Vietnam, and the country became communist anyway. So there were times where we would intervene in another country to try to keep the Soviet Union from getting involved. And both countries had nuclear weapons. We built a nuclear arsenal of over 1,500 nuclear warheads. But part of the reason we never directly went to war against the Soviet Union was because of a policy called mutually assured destruction. Have any of you heard of this policy? Mutually assured destruction? No? Okay. Mutually assured destruction is basically a scenario in which two countries are so well matched militarily and weapon-wise that neither side can win without huge amounts of damage. So because the Soviet Union also had nuclear weapons, if for some reason we decided to drop a nuclear bomb on Moscow, they could retaliate by dropping a nuclear bomb on Washington, D.C. So you're not going to engage in a nuclear war because neither side can win in this scenario. It's why there tends to be a bit of panic when India and Pakistan are on the verge of war, because both countries have nuclear weapons. So if both sides are evenly matched, and there's no way either side can win without significant losses, they are less likely to want to go to war with each other. We're not going to drop a nuclear bomb on Russia, because they would drop one on us. So that's partly why it was always a Cold War, why we never went directly to war with them, because the losses would have been too great, even if we did eventually win the war. And in terms of the countries with nuclear weapons, it's us, the UK, France, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and possibly Israel, though they've never confirmed nor denied that they might have a nuclear weapon. So it's a small group of countries, which is pretty lucky because, well, the nuclear weapons are very, very destructive. Okay. There's another major theory in international relations, and it's called the rational actor model. And type it in here. Okay, so the rational actor model essentially says that you have to know that the United States will respond with force if attacked, and that our adversary is capable of rationally assessing the costs and risks of attacking the United States. So essentially, the rational actor model assumes that anyone who attacks the United States is capable of rationally thinking about the pros and cons of doing so. Here's the problem with this. Terrorist groups are not rational by nature. They do not care what happens after. All they care about is being successful in their attack. The hijackers on 9/11 didn't give a damn what happened after. All they cared about was succeeding in their mission. ISIS members don't care what happens after they blow up a concert or drive a truck through a crowd. They don't care. The other problem too is, how do you strike back against a terrorist group? It's tricky. If the members of ISIS disappear after carrying out an attack, it's hard to know who to go after for that. So terrorism is not rational by nature. So we can't respond to terrorism the way we would respond to another country attacking us. It has to be a very different response. So after 9/11, President Bush decided to switch to a policy of preventive war. And essentially he said, look, if we are being threatened by another country, we'll strike first. We're not going to wait for you to come after us. So he wouldn't rule out the threat of war against Iran or North Korea. Basically, he said, you even threaten us, we will hit you. President Obama shifted away from that. He used sanctions and diplomacy first, and only wanted to use the military if no other options worked. So he wasn't willing to threaten to send our military abroad unless necessary. But we've had some issues dealing with Russia, especially in Syria. So there has been an ongoing civil war in Syria for the better part of a decade. We went in to support the rebels who are trying to overthrow the dictator Bashar al-Assad. Russia intervened to help prop up the dictator. So now you've got us on one side, Russia on the other, and then ISIS comes into play as well. So now you've basically got 3 separate areas of Syria under different control. Part controlled by Assad, part controlled by ISIS, part controlled by the rebels. We did work together largely with Russia and other countries to push ISIS out of Syria. But because Assad is being supported by the Russians, it doesn't look like he's going to be removed from power, despite the fact that he has used chemical weapons on civilians, bombed hospitals, and so on. So basically, Syria is kind of a stalemate, and we're not going to be able to overthrow Assad like we wanted. There are also issues with Russia trying to illegally annex the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine. The Obama administration was willing to lift sanctions on Iran. Iran was trying to develop a nuclear weapon. So we basically said to them, look, if you promise to stop trying to develop a nuclear weapon, we'll lift economic sanctions on you. So they agreed. But even though they were living up to their end of the bargain, when President Trump came into office, he said, I don't trust the Iranians, and put the sanctions back into place, which has inevitably resulted in Iran going back to work on a nuclear weapon, because if you're going to be punished for something you didn't do, you might as well go ahead and do it, right? If your parents preemptively ground you for a party, you might as well go to the party. And it doesn't make sense to put sanctions back on a country when they're actually complying. But nonetheless, President Trump chose to put the sanctions back into place. We also assassinated one of the heads of their military. So right now things are not great with Iran. With President-elect Biden, who knows? Maybe things will calm down again, but not likely right now. Okay, any questions on that? Everyone's good? Okay. All right, so the next biggest area of foreign policy is economic. Makes sense, right? You want to make sure the world is secure, and you also want to make sure the economy and economic ties are successful. We are a member of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO as it's also known. It was established in 1995 with the idea of promoting global free trade. We're living in a time where we can have products shipped from China in less than a week, where there's huge amounts of trade and business being done across borders. So the WTO exists to help facilitate that trade. We're also a member of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association or Agreement, although that is being renegotiated. Basically, it's the trade treaty between us, Canada, and Mexico, looking to reduce tariffs and increase trade. It's why we see so many trucks coming along the border here. They're coming in and out of Mexico. Now, the WTO is very rightly criticized for not focusing on the needs of poor countries and for not focusing on human rights concerns. They're not looking at child labor in countries, forced labors in countries like China, or environmental damage. There was a factory in China, an Apple factory, where the workers were committing suicide because they were basically locked up for 18, 19 hours a day. So the management installed nets outside of the building so they could try to prevent people from committing suicide. Obviously, that's not ideal, right? There should be more focus on problems like that. They also tend to overlook the fact that in Saudi Arabia, people are routinely executed in public, the lack of rights for women, and so on. We also do heavily subsidize agriculture. We routinely place heavy subsidies on products like wheat and cotton. Now, subsidies in and of themselves are not bad things. If there is a drought, subsidies help keep farmers in business. They help keep the farm from going under. The problem is we still pay subsidies on agriculture when the farmers have a good year. So it is much cheaper to buy cotton from Georgia than it is to buy it from South Africa. So poorer countries cannot compete against us on the global market. They can't compete with us in agriculture. So it hurts poorer countries because their products don't make it to the global market as easily. In Kenya, it's cheaper to buy a can of tomatoes from the Netherlands than it is from a nearby farm. So unfortunately, the US and Europe's over-reliance on subsidies do hurt poor countries. And then, of course, there's issues with outsourcing. 2.8 million manufacturing jobs lost in the early 2000s, not coming back to the United States. And of course, if you call Verizon or Apple or somewhere, what country are you reaching? Who are you talking to? Someone in India, right? More likely than not, the call center is now located in India. So a lot of that is because of free trade and the cheaper cost of doing business overseas. So you don't have to pay a minimum wage in India or China or Vietnam. So there's a lot of backlash from Americans about, well, all our jobs have been outsourced and they're not coming back. So how are you going to help us? Okay, there's also humanitarian policy, not as huge, but still very important. We are the signatory to some international environmental treaties, but we haven't signed on to the Paris Agreement, and we did withdraw from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. So unfortunately, we're not doing enough to help with the issues of climate change, especially because we still can't agree on whether or not it's real. Our politicians have not reached a consensus on that. Now, we are also party to many international human rights treaties. The UN Convention on Genocide, prohibiting the use of child soldiers in war, to Geneva Conventions, which outline how to treat prisoners during war, and so on. Unfortunately, economic policy tends to overtake human rights policy when we're dealing with our major trading partners. We're kind of overlooking the fact that right now China is committing genocide against the minority Uyghurs, who are Muslims. We overlook the fact that in Saudi Arabia, again, people are executed in public with a sword. And also, at the end of last year, a couple of suspected terrorists were crucified in public in Saudi Arabia, and we didn't really say anything about that. We also didn't do much when Saudi Arabia kidnapped a journalist in a Turkish embassy and murdered him. Why? They're one of our biggest trading partners. We're quick to call out countries like North Korea. We don't really say anything about Saudi Arabia or China. So unfortunately, the policy of the US government is largely to put economic policy ahead of humanitarian policy. We do provide some humanitarian aid. We've spent about $5 billion to help with the Syrian refugee crisis. We sent medical aid, food, and rescue teams to Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, and Japan after the earthquake and tsunami in 2011. And we spent about $300 million helping the recently independent country of South Sudan with famine. So if a country is experiencing famine or an earthquake, we do tend to send humanitarian aid to try and help out. But more recently, we've also seen issues with the debate around refugee policy. It is very, very hard to get permission to come to the United States as a refugee. You have to go through an extensive background check. You have to be fingerprinted. The process can take up to 2 years to be allowed to relocate to the United States. Despite that, we have not taken in a fair number of refugees from Syria. Most of them have ended up in countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. The lucky ones are in Europe. But we haven't really been as responsive to the humanitarian refugee crisis as we probably should be. So unfortunately, our refugee policy's taken a bit of a hit, and we aren't doing as much compared to the rest of the world. We used to take in a lot more refugees. In the 1990s, we took in the Lost Boys of Sudan. There was a civil war between North Sudan, which was Muslim, and South Sudan, which was Christian. And a lot of the children in South Sudan ended up having to flee Sudan and leave for Ethiopia and Kenya, walking hundreds of miles to get to safety. So evangelicals in the United States convinced the Clinton administration to take in these children. So for a while, we were taking in Sudanese refugees until 9/11, and then we stopped doing so. So previous to 9/11, our refugee policy was a bit more generous, not so much today. All right, so in terms of some of the actors that we see involved in foreign policy, the president constitutionally does have the most authority in this area. He or she can make treaties and accept ambassadors. The reality, though, is that most presidents don't have foreign policy experience. There are some exceptions. President George H.W. Bush had been head of the CIA for a while, but most of them work in domestic policy. So they basically have to learn foreign policy on the job. And no one had a quicker turnaround time on foreign policy than George W. Bush. He comes into office and 9/11 happens. And he has to figure out how to respond to that very quickly. We're talking about a president who's 8 months into his first term in office. So he had to learn very quickly how to respond to 9/11. So he shifted foreign policy to national security. He helped in terms of the war on terror, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and of TSA. And he was willing to engage in unilateral action in the Middle East. Basically, President Bush said, we're going to war in Iraq, and you're either with us or you're against us, and if you're against us, get out of the way. President Obama was more willing to work with our NATO allies. Through a NATO mission, NATO was able to remove the dictator Muammar Gaddafi from power in Libya, which was both good and bad because now Libya is basically pure chaos and anarchy, but the idea was good. He also wanted to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, and he did start, withdrawing some of the troops. And he was also president when our military is finally able to find and kill Osama bin Laden. So obviously one of his biggest successes in terms of foreign policy was eliminating Osama bin Laden as a global threat. All right, in terms of the bureaucracy, the major foreign policy actors are the Secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury, which makes sense. If we're looking at going to war, we need to know about how much it will cost, troop preparedness, and so on. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is also another actor, and of course the Director of the CIA. We need to know where the threats are, how to respond to them, and so on. And then, of course, post 9/11, there was the creation of a brand new cabinet department, which is the Department of Homeland Security. Homeland Security has 22 agencies that were relocated into the department to better coordinate their actions. So ICE is part of Homeland Security, FEMA, Border Patrol, and so on. We had to learn the hard way that our intelligence has to work together, because we didn't prevent 9/11 from happening because the CIA had one piece of the puzzle, the FBI had the other. But because the two weren't talking to each other, nobody was able to put it together in time. So obviously you can't have that happening. You can't have two agencies who probably could have figured out what was going on if they'd been allowed to work together. There's also issues with arguments between the head of the CIA and the Defense Department. The CIA tends to be a bit trigger happy. They tend to want to go in and try to fix things. And the Defense Department has to say to them, look, we can't do that. We don't have the money, we don't have the personnel. There's also within Homeland Security a new Director of National Intelligence who coordinates intelligence information and gives it to the President on a daily basis. The Defense Department controls over 80% of the national intelligence capabilities and funds. So if the President wants to take military action, he'd better get the Defense Department on board. And he'd better know what we're looking at in terms of time, cost, and so on. And the military has combatant commanders assigned to every region in the world so we can know what's going on. What's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. So we have less surprise when something happens like the overthrowing of a leader or the outbreak of a civil war somewhere. There's a great miniseries on Hulu that talks about the intelligence failures prior to 9/11 called The Looming Tower, if you're interested in learning more about what happened. Okay. Congress also gets involved in foreign policy because Congress has the power to declare war. So if hypothetically President-elect Biden gets into office and says, okay, I want to go to war with Iran, well, you have to get Congress on board with it. You can't just send a bunch of troops abroad and be like, okay, we're done. It's also, of course, the role of the Senate to approve a treaty. And you do need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to approve a treaty. So this is why it can take forever to get a treaty approved. Again, it took us 40 years to sign the UN Convention on Genocide. Most presidents don't have 40 years to wait. So to get around the issues with Congress, the president is allowed to enter into an executive agreement. Executive agreements have the weight and authority of a treaty, but they are only enforceable as long as the president is in office. There are two types of executive agreements. A sole executive agreement is one in which Congress is not obligated to provide funding. So basically, Congress can say, well, you're on your own for this. An executive congressional agreement is one where the President submits the agreement to Congress for approval. You only need a majority vote, so 51%, to get the congressional executive agreement passed. With this one, Congress will provide money because Congress was part of the agreement process. So for a sole agreement, Congress doesn't have to provide funding. For the executive congressional, it does. And again, these agreements are only enforceable as long as the president is in office. Congress also has several committees that look at foreign policy issues. The Senate has the Foreign Relations Committee, Armed Services, Homeland Security, and Government Affairs. The House has a Foreign Affairs Committee, Homeland Security, and Armed Services. So they can look at intelligence information, military, and so on. There's also hearings on foreign policy issues like the attack on our embassy in Benghazi, Libya, and the failures of the U.S. government to protect the embassy. Congress also held hearings on the 9/11 attacks and put together a report that explained how it happened and why it happened. So they can hold hearings on things like homeland security, terrorism, mass shootings, diplomatic issues, and so on. And these committees can compel people to come and testify. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was called multiple times before Congress to testify about what happened in Benghazi. So they can force people to testify before Congress. Okay, interest groups are also going to get involved here. And like domestic policy, in foreign policy, economic interest groups are going to be more successful and more influential than human rights groups. Manufacturing is going to have better luck than citizens' human rights group. Human rights groups can ask the government to investigate human rights abuses in China, but they're not going to do much about that since China is a major trading partner. There are also religious and ethnic interest groups that get involved in foreign policy. Jewish Americans include groups like AIPAC that are pretty successful in lobbying for close ties with Israel. Military support, financial support, kind of looking the other way at the fact that Israel is building illegal settlements in Palestine, or what should be Palestine. The moving of the capital to Jerusalem by the Trump administration, which was beyond controversial. There's also Irish Americans. If you look at the island of Ireland, it's basically split in two. The majority is the Republic of Ireland. There's a very small piece to the north that is controlled by the United Kingdom. The Republic of Ireland is largely Catholic. Northern Ireland is largely Protestant. Catholic Irish Americans want the two parts of Ireland reunited. They want the UK to give up its control of Northern Ireland and return it to the Republic. So they've pushed for the US to intervene in the crisis in Northern Ireland and try to push for reconciliation. And for a while, in the 80s and 90s, police departments like Boston and New York were actually sending money to the Irish Republican Army, which is one of the biggest groups in Northern Ireland that has carried out terrorist attacks, and then they realized, wait, we're kind of supporting terrorism, maybe we should stop. Now, there are human rights groups that are able to have some say in policy. And Amnesty International is one of the biggest. They are very, very influential. They'll expose human rights abuses and shame various regimes into changing their behavior. If they lock up a human rights worker in Ethiopia, Amnesty International will petition and campaign and shame the government into letting that person go. So Amnesty International has been successful in promoting human rights abroad and getting people out of detention and so on. There's also environmental activist groups, Greenpeace, the NRDC, Sierra Club, and others that are trying to get the US to sign on to some environmental treaties, invest in alternative energies, reduce pollution, and so on. And then there's also the role of the public. The longer the war drags on, the less support there is for a war. We tend to want our wars to be short, quick, and successful. So the first Persian Gulf War was very well supported. Took us less than 2 years, not a high amount of casualties, and we were successful in the end. But the longer the wars have dragged out in Iraq and Afghanistan, the less support there is for the American people, and the more pressure there is on the government to bring the troops home, end the war, and stop having people being killed or spending money abroad. So again, the longer the war goes on, the less support there is from the public, and the more pressure there is on the government to find a way out of the war, out of the situation. All right, so overall, the key players in foreign policy are going to vary. Sometimes it's going to be the CIA, or the State Department, or APAC. It's going to depend on what area of policy and what part of the world we're talking about. And the president is going to have the most power for foreign policy during a time of crisis. Right after 9/11, Congress was pretty much willing to give the president whatever he wanted. Grounding the planes for a week after 9/11, creating the Department of Homeland Security, passing the Patriot Act. No one was really willing to oppose the president. He had huge amounts of support from the American people, and Congress basically just went along with what the president wanted. Same thing with FDR during the start of World War II. Right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Congress was willing to give the president whatever he wanted. So when we're dealing with a time of crisis, the president does have the most power over foreign policy, and Congress is largely going to get in line with them. We are seeing more non-formal actors and interest groups influencing foreign policy. The reality is, because we're fighting a war against non-state actors, we can't rely as much on our traditional military and security policy. We've had to shift some of the attitudes we have on how we make policy, how we fight back against Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Al-Shabaab, how we try to keep Americans safe. And we are also influenced by other countries. We're not going to go to war with Saudi Arabia. We're not going to alienate our allies. We're not going to go to war with China and lose our biggest trading partner. We're not going to go to war with Saudi Arabia and lose access to oil. And sometimes we are willing to listen to our allies, like the UK or France, and have them tell us, look, maybe back off of this a little bit. And there's a related theory to this called the democratic peace theory. The democratic peace theory posits that two democracies will not go to war with each other. There's some exceptions to this, but by and large, that is true. And again, we're not going to go to war against our trading partners. We're not going to go after the countries that are our allies. We're not going to declare war on the UK. Realistically, we're going to listen to what our allies want, and we're going to be careful about some of the things we say towards Saudi Arabia, China, and other countries. Because again, you don't want to take off the people who are your biggest economic allies. Okay, any questions, comments? Have you heard of any of these theories before? No? Okay. Alright, so next week is finals. What we're going to try to do is meet at our regular class time. If you have a final that conflicts with this class, go to that final, it's not a problem. But if you can, we'll meet here next Tuesday. I'll show you guys a short documentary and we'll be done with the semester. So the final exam is posted in Blackboard. You will turn it in through Blackboard. It's due a week from today. If you need an extension, let me know. But again, it's the same format as the midterm. 4 short essay questions, a page to a page and a half, double spaced per question, open book, etc. Okay, any questions on the final? Everyone's good. Okay. So Thursday, we'll finish discussing chapter 18. I'll see you guys here next Tuesday. Enjoy the rest